Hi, it's Carly McAvoy. Today I'm talking about adding sign numbers or integers. So if you have a positive 3, you can write it just as 3, or you could put the positive in front of it. But when you write negative 3, you have to include that negative sign in front of it. And you can see where we have parentheses in some places. That's because we just don't want our addition symbol to run into our negative sign. So that's why we separate those. It wouldn't change the answer if we remove those. Just a refresher, if you have 4 positives and 5 more positives, you have all positives, and that's going to give you 9. No shock there. But if you have this kind of a thing where you have all negatives, you have 3 negatives. I'm just going to draw the negative sign. So you have 3 negatives, and then you have 5 more negatives. And so you have all negatives, just like in the first one you had all positives. How many negatives do you have? You have a total of 8. So that's going to be your answer, -8. So we're going to do that, type that in here, and when I put that in, I have to include the negative. I can't just put 8 because I have to say -8 when I'm saying that. So that would be -8. Including that negative in there is important. All right, so for the next one, we have 2 and 6. We have 2 positives and 6 positives, so we're just going to have a total of 8. No shock there. Here we have all negatives, 10 negatives, and 3 more negatives. That's going to be a total of 13 negatives, so we have to put that negative symbol in there. And then the next one down here on this row, we start having some negatives and some positives. And so that's where it gets a little more interesting. If I have 5 negatives, let's say I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 negatives, and I have 2 positives. Well, then you can see that you have more negatives than you do positives. And then what you have more of is what your answer is going to end up to be. So what I have is this negative and this positive would cancel each other out. This negative and this positive would cancel each other out, and I would have 3 negatives left over. So the way I like to think of it is, what do you have more of? Do you have more negatives or do you have more positives? Once you decide I have more negatives, then the question is, how many more negatives? Once you realize that you have 3 more negatives, then that's going to be your final answer for this, -3. So it could be answer could be negative or positive when you're adding some of each. You have to decide what you have more of. So in this one, you have 7 positives and 5 negatives. Those 5 negatives would come over and wipe out 5 of those positives, but you'd have 2 positives left over. So the question is, what do we have more of? We have more positives. How many more positives? Well, the answer to that is 2. So the answer is +2. And again, you can put the plus sign in front of it or not when you have a positive. What do we have here? We have 4 negatives and 7 positives. So we have more positives. The question is, how many more positives? Well, these 4 negatives would take away 4 positives and leave 3 positives behind. So that would be +3. So that's how I would do it. Also, you can try practicing that on your calculator. It's a good thing to practice. Okay, and then over here, what do I have more of? Do I have more negatives or more positives? And what you should see here is I don't have more of either. I have the exact same number of negatives and positives. Therefore, all those negatives are going to cancel out all those positives and leave us with 0. Okay, down here we have, again, the same thing where we have some positives and some negatives. Here we have 7 negatives and 2 positives. You can draw the lines out like I did before if that's helpful. But in this case, we definitely have more negatives. So the question is, how many more negatives? And the answer is 5 more negatives. So that will be -5. What about this one? We have 8 negatives and 5 positives. So you would say, I have more negatives. How many more negatives? Well, those 5 positives would wipe out 5 of those negatives, leaving behind 3 negatives. All right, over here, this is where we put the parentheses to separate our plus and our minus. We have more negatives because 9 is greater than 7 with absolute value-wise. So we have more negatives, and so we have 2 more negatives, meaning that our final answer here would be -2. Down below, right here, when I have the same number of negatives and positives, those are opposites, and those always give you 0 because we had the same number of positives as negatives. That's going to cancel to 0. Here we have 9 negatives, and that's it. We don't have any positives. 0 does not have a sign, so when we add 0 to something, it doesn't change it. It's still going to be negative 9. And finally, here we have negative 11 and positive 20. So you should be able to see right away that you have more positives. And then you ask yourself, how many more positives? And you can figure that out by subtraction. 20 minus 11. We've got 9 more positives, so that's going to be positive 9. So that's the basic idea for adding sign numbers or adding negatives. And I'll look at some more in a few minutes in the next video.